Hello and welcome to the Dover Church of Christ online worship service. This is part 2 of our New Testament survey. In part 1, we discussed God's people in light of the rise and fall of great nations. The rise and fall of these great nations in the Jewish context is very important in us understanding what's going on inside of our Bibles. In the midst of these empires, the Jews were a geopolitical football being kicked around by major players vying for world domination. But in the midst of all of this chaos and all of this struggle, they had hope that God would resume his power, resume his strength, and usher in this kingdom of God where this Messiah would rule greater than any empire that's ever been known, above all the empires of the world. So the Jews had hope that God would send his promised Messiah. In part 1 of our New Testament survey, we tried to explore the question, why did Christ come when he did? Why did he come in the first century and not the 21st century? We're going to explore that a little bit more in our lesson for today. So we're going to begin with the time period between the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the 400 years that leads up to the New Testament. This period of time is one of the most overlooked eras in biblical history. But it is so important when we look at the scope of his story, God's story. It is this fullness of time, this time where God is preparing the world for his one and only Son. Paul describes this as the pleroma, the fullness of time that's found in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. And I want to let you know something else, that this, in my mind, when I see this full scope, this whole story played out, it plays a significant and very important applicable lesson for us even today. So let's pick up where we left off in last week's lesson, where there's a battle between the Greeks and the Persians. When the Persian Empire invaded Greece, Greece was not a unified state with an established border, but a polis, which were independent, distinct cities. And a new brilliant leader and a politician from the backwoods of northern Greece would emerge, named Philip of Macedon. Philip would seek to unite Greece and dreamed of conquering Persia. Yet he didn't finish the job. He died. But he would be succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander the Great. Alexander would unify Greece, but soon after he set off to avenge Greece and conquer Persia. Within 10 years, the Greeks, under the leadership of Alexander, became an empire. Alexander the Great's influence over the world and his military genius cannot be overstated. He was the pupil of Aristotle, and Aristotle was the pupil of Plato, and Plato was the pupil of Socrates, the big three of philosophy. Aristotle was passionate about the studies of politics, art, medicine, and philosophy. He was obsessed with a system to unify all branches of knowledge. This search drove him in the hopes to unify all people culturally. Throughout Alexander's empire, he emphasized Hellenism. Hellenism is the spread of the same language, culture, and moral beliefs. Hellenism was taught by a professional class of scholars, teachers, centered in Alexandria, Egypt, where a great library stood. These schools were the main center of intellectual activity and spread throughout the empire. They taught writing, science, reading, philosophy, and arithmetic, with an emphasis on the liberal arts. Language unites, and the language of Koine Greek became the first universal language. So Hellenization is what helped us get the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament, and it's often quoted in our New Testaments. And as many of you know, The New Testament was not written in English, but it was written in Koine Greek. Alexander the Great died a sudden death in Nebuchadnezzar's palace at Babylon at the young age of 32. His empire was divided into 4 kingdoms. Eventually, these powers consolidated into 2 Greek dynasties, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. In 198 BC, a Seleucid ruler, Antiochus the Third, annexed Israel from the Ptolemies and accelerated the Hellenization process. The Hellenization process was not well received by conservative Jews. The Hasids, or the pious ones, fought to keep the growing influence of Hellenization out. Antiochus the Third's son, Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, which meant manifest or manifest God, took the throne after his father's death. The Jews referred to him as Antiochus Epimanes, insane or madman. He is referred to by the Jews as the abomination that makes desolation in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. Why that is? Because he brought upon the Jews a radically anti-Jewish program unlike anything they had ever seen before. Antiochus IV made observance of the Sabbath, circumcision, and possessing a copy of the Hebrew Bible a capital offense. He even took an unclean animal, and not just any unclean animal, but a pig to the temple and sacrificed it on the sacred altar in honor of Zeus. Needless to say, this act did not set well with the Jews. A few years later, they revolted under the leadership of a priest named Mattathias. This revolt was known as the Maccabean Revolt. The family launched guerrilla warfare against Antiochus' forces. After the death of Mattathias, his third son, Judas, the Hammer Maccabeus, stepped into his father's role as leader. The revolt succeeded in securing religious freedom and the opening of the temple. And this is still celebrated with us today by the Jews. It's called Hanukkah, or Festival of Lights. After reclaiming the temple, all the oil was defiled, but a single vial, and the vial kept the menorah lit, which lasted 8 days, and it was considered a miracle. Hellenization in the Maccabean Revolt resulted in the emergence of 4 prominent sects in Jerusalem. They played an important role in our study of the New Testament. If you ever read through there and asked, I wonder where these Sadducees and Pharisees and other groups came from, they came from this particular time period. These 4 prominent sects were the Zealots, Essenes, Sadducees, and the Pharisees. The Zealots were a violent political party who sought complete independence from any foreign power. The Essenes were an ascetic group, removed from civilization, while volunteering to a life of poverty. The last 2 are the most important, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees were priests tasked with taking care of the temple and saw only the written form of the Torah as divine. The Pharisees were the most influential among the sects. The Pharisees, or the separated ones, were to be zealous for the covenant and to every aspect of the law. Although they collapsed into self-righteous legalism and ritualism by the time of Christ, their original concern was fighting the cultural influences of Hellenism that were dangerous to the Jews and contrary to the law. So they sought to find ways to make the law applicable. The chief religious body of all the Jews were made up of primarily, but not exclusively, powerful Pharisees, which were called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a Greek term, by the way, that means council. The irony shouldn't be lost on us, considering Hellenism. As time passed, the Greek Empire grew unstable, fragmented, and weak. And little did the Jews or the Greeks know that another great empire was beginning to rise in the West. This empire would change the world forever. This is one of the greatest empires that mankind has ever known. Enter the Romans. A small town in the west with new ambitious power would begin to grow, known as Rome. The Roman legions were cunning, vicious, and brutal. They were not known for their intellect, but their legion army and gladiatorial games. Rome established its dominance and extended its territory by defeating its rival Carthage and winning the Punic Wars in 146. The result of the Punic Wars would place Rome into contact with Hellenization. So how would the Romans handle Hellenization? They busied themselves adopting and adapting it in order to blend it with their own culture. Greek became their second state language. The gods of the Romans were blended with the gods of the Greeks. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, Aphrodite became Venus, and so forth. Rome was also different in how it expanded its empire. They gave citizenship rights to those whom they conquered and submitted to their rule. You can read about that in the book of Acts. Paul uses this to his advantage many times. The result of the Romans' contacts with Hellenism gave rise to the Greco-Roman culture, which is their blend of Hellenization. The result would change world's language, culture, government, and religion, but also introduce it to the bathhouse, an elegant decadence for the upper class. Two powerful generals of the Roman army would expand its empire even further. One was a general by the name of Julius Caesar. He expanded Rome's rule to the west, conquering the Gauls, which included modern Germany and France, all the way to the island of Britain. Meanwhile, another Roman general was expanding the empire in the east by the name of Pompey the Great. He would squash Spartacus's rebellion, destroy pirating ships, and expand to the east when he conquered Israel in 63 BC. These two generals would soon become Rome's future. After Julius Caesar's victory in the west, he headed back to Rome. The Senate asked him to leave his army behind, but he refused. Caesar made a life-changing decision to cross the Rubicon and march into Rome and crown himself emperor. This angered the Senate and Pompey. So Julius and Pompey squared off in battle. Neither general had ever lost a battle until Julius defeated Pompey. After Julius defeated Pompey in handling other skirmishes, he entered Rome again and infamously declared Veni, Vidi, Vici, which means I came, I saw, I conquered. And he would gain control and become dictator. But on the Ides of March 44 BC, Julius was assassinated. And little did anyone know he would give his wealth to his nephew, a 19-year-old named Gaius Octavius, otherwise known as Octavian. Octavian wanted revenge for Caesar's death and was driven to punish all who plotted against him. In 31 BC, he defeated his last rival, Mark Antony, and his lover, Cleopatra, in the Battle of Actium. Which, if you want to know more about that, watch the movie Cleopatra starring Elizabeth Taylor. It involves Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, and the whole thing. The Battle of Actium was the most important battle in Roman history. The result was the end of the Roman Republic. Octavian was left as sole ruler of Rome and took every title that could be given to him. He named himself Caesar Augustus, respected one. He would expand the Roman Empire and rule for 43 years, where he established Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This is the emperor we read about in Luke chapter 2 in verse 1 that says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." Caesar Augustus wanted the whole world to be known that Rome was under their control. With riches pouring in, houses and colosseums built, construction, innovation, and expansion boomed. But with such a vast empire, Augustus had to install vassal kings to rule in the outer kingdom. Enter Herod the Great. one of the villains of the New Testament. Herod was a vicious king responsible for killing members of his own family. But he was made vassal king over the Jews in 40 BC by Caesar Augustus. The Herodian dynasty would be responsible for appeasing the Jews by rebuilding the temple. So this is how the New Testament begins, with the Jews under severe oppression, under the dominant rule of the Romans and a very oppressive king. The Jews and the whole world were seeing massive and rapid changing and opening up to new ideas and new thoughts. Some saw this change as great progress, yet others not so much. All they saw was chaotic change, declining morals, declining norms, social unrest, violent protest, death, and oppression. And the Jews felt nostalgia. They just wanted the good old days back. Back when they could just worship God how they wanted to and not worry about their own children or their people being influenced by the evils of culture. But more than anything else, they wanted their old kingdom back. The kingdom like they had under David or Solomon. Look, they even would like to have a kingdom like that they just saw under Alexander the Great, or maybe even Darius and the Persians, or maybe Caesar and the Romans. A lot of them wanted to be just like every other kingdom in the world. They wanted their own ruler. They wanted their own power, and they pleaded God for it. Reminds us of what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So the Jews pled with God and begged him to give them back their strength, begged him to give them back their dignity. They went to the temple and prayed, and they asked God to give them a revolution, give them their power, give them their strength back, give them their Messiah, give them their king. They were ready, and they prayed about it consistently and often. But yet, God was hearing them the whole time. God had a plan. Remember, this is God's story. He is going to bring the Messiah. He is going to bring the King. Then, as God had foretold centuries earlier, in a small, insignificant, rural town in the middle of nowhere, controlled by the Romans, a town called Bethlehem, a child would be born. This child was to become the hope of the world. He was going to usher in a kingdom without territory, without boundaries, without demanding the bloodshed of his own citizens, but giving up his own blood for his citizens. And he was to establish peace, unlike the Pax Romana of the Romans. But he was going to give peace, a certain kind of peace, a certain kind of hope that everyone in the world desperately needs. Micah is going to give us that prophecy in Micah chapter 5, beginning with verse 2. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me, who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. This intertestamental period is one of the most amazing stories of the Bible. You can just see how God is working throughout all the scriptures. You can see how God is working throughout other kingdoms just to make this magnificent moment in history of time and space, of the pleroma, the fullness of time when God is going to establish his king in his kingdom. Look, I gained a tremendous amount of hope. Even in times of despair where plagues and riots and all sorts of things are going on in our world, that I can read the Bible and see myself in a larger story where despite any of that, we can see that God's kingdom, as he promised in the Bible, is a kingdom that shall not end. And we have a king that's above, a king that loves us, a king that is ruling over us. And we can place our full faith and trust in him. That is such a blessing. I hope you stay tuned till next week when we look at part 3 of our introduction of our New Testament survey. May God bless.